the Balkans and Eastern Rome to the mid-6th century. The Eastern Roman Empire's success in escaping the fate of the Western Empire at the barbarians' hands was due to its superior economic and demographic situation. The Western Empire essentially was agrarian, sparsely populated, and commercially isolated relative to the Eastern. Rome's eastern provinces lay at the heart of millennia-old civilized human development, the western ones existed on the fringes. Populous Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia enjoyed abundant and varied food resources culled from a mild climate and extensive fertile lowlands. The smaller western populations mostly faced a harsh, cold climate, extensive dense forests, and rugged, mountainous terrain. Their primary food resources lay in North Africa's coastal lowlands. The Eastern Empire served as the terminus for numerous trade routes stretching eastward to India and China and southward into East Africa, and cross-border trade directly tapped into the riches of Persia, Sudan, and Ethiopia. The western provinces not only were dependent on the eastern ones for access to the fruits of long-distance trade but had as cross-border trading partners only primitive Germanic, Celtic, and Berber tribal societies, which faced even harsher environmental conditions than their own. All told, the Eastern Empire possessed decisive advantages over the Western for withstanding the lengthy inroads of invaders. While this generalized picture held true for the Eastern Empire as a whole, it was only slightly relevant for the empire's Balkan provinces, where the prevalence of mountainous and forested terrain created a situation closely resembling that in the Western Empire: a fragmented population, limited agricultural lands, and a relatively harsh climate. The peninsula's significance for Rome lay in its roles as a land bridge linking the western to the eastern provinces and as a bulwark against northern threats to the chain of coastal trading centers in its south, such as Durrës, Thessaloniki, and Byzantium, that linked the western centers to the eastern markets by sea. Nature favored the peninsula for both roles. The tightly packed mountain ranges permitted crossing in a limited number of places, where rivers cut passes that could serve as roadways. Otherwise, overland travel was restricted to narrow coastal lowlands where they existed. The road network built was simple by Roman standards and somewhat restricted. It consisted of three major routes. The oldest was the Via Egnatia, which began at the Adriatic port city of Durrës, climbed through the Albanian Alps along the Shkumban River to Ohrid in Macedonia, where it then wended eastward through the northern Pindos ranges to Thessaloniki, continued along the Aegean coast, across southern Thrace, and terminated at Byzantium, on the shore of the Bosphorus Strait. This was the shortest, most direct route linking the Roman west and east. The second major highway was the Belgrade-Singidunum, Byzantine military highway, which ran diagonally across the peninsula from northwest to southeast, starting at Belgrade. It then followed the Morava River valley to Nisos, traversed the southern outcrops of the western Balkan mountains to Sofia, Serdica, after which it hugged the Maritsa River down to Thrace and joined the Via Egnatia west of Byzantium. Also called the Diagonal Highway, it was a strategic line of communication directly tying northern Italy and Gaul to the eastern provinces. These two routes were linked by a third running north and south, which used the Morava and Vardar river valleys through Macedonia to connect Nis and Thessaloniki. None of these routes was completely free of difficult passages. All suffered from adverse seasonal weather conditions and the potential for local banditry. The limited nature of the road network placed constraints on military, economic, and personal movement in the peninsula. Although the mountains made overland communications difficult, they did provide military defense positions protecting the peninsula's interior against attacks from the north. The few primary invasion routes following existing major roadways could be blocked effectively by fortifications erected in the passes through which they ran. Lacking fortifications, planned ambushes could suffice. The Balkan Mountains stretched across half of the peninsula like a natural fortress wall, and the northern faces of the Dinaric and Albanian Alps could be used for the same purpose. A military drawback to the mountain defenses was that not all of the numerous small passes cut by lesser tributaries of the major rivers and scattered throughout all of the ranges could be fortified. An enemy with knowledge of them could outflank the principal fortifications guarding the main roadways. Thus defensively, the peninsula's mountains were both a blessing and a curse. By the mid-6th century the Balkan Peninsula's populations mostly were acculturated into Rome's Hellenic civilized society. In the south, the Greeks and the Greek language predominated. To their northeast, the Thracians were Hellenized. The Illyrians, who lived north and west of the Greeks, fell heavily under Latin cultural influence from Italy. Their Dalmatian and Istrian lands in the northwest formed part of the Latin-speaking Roman prefecture of Italy, although Illyrians in the central regions of the peninsula were under the sway of the Greek-speaking prefecture of Illyricum. Numerous Illyrians isolated in the high mountains probably escaped serious contact with either Latins or Greeks and retained their native language. In the far north, the Dacians may have preserved a corrupted Latin linguistic legacy stemming from a long Roman military presence that ended in the 3rd century. Except for the Greek-inhabited south, the Balkans constituted little more than a transit zone for west-east military movements and an economic backwater before the early 4th century, when Emperor Constantine the Great, 306–37, established his imperial capital at ancient Byzantium in 330. The city was enlarged and renamed Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The situation then changed. With the center of imperial power relocated to the region's southeast, the peninsula's inhabitants living close to the major roadways enjoyed a brief period of commercial prosperity and expanded urbanization, as traffic to and from the capital increased. In regions away from major routes, however, local barter trade in kind remained the norm. Despite Rome's reputation as a highly urbanized society, the majority of the empire's Balkan population was rural. Land was divided among individual free smallholdings, free village holdings, and large estates owned by magnates and worked by serfs. The exact proportion of each in the landholding scheme is unclear, but most likely the share of great landed estates generally rose at the expense of the others throughout the 4th through 6th centuries. This trend was aided by ever-escalating state taxes levied to pay for military expenses. Numerous freeholders fled into the mountains to evade rapacious tax collectors, and their properties were expropriated by the government or the magnates. Most taxes went to support the defensive army established by Constantine I in the 4th century. The empire's borders were manned by frontier forces recruited from local inhabitants, fugitives, pensioned army veterans, refugees, and captives. Their task was to hinder an invading enemy until a mobile elite force under the emperor's command arrived to deliver the decisive blow. The elite force was comprised of paid professionals, usually barbarian mercenaries, organized into formal military units stationed strategically in the interior. In the early 6th century the frontier forces in the northern Balkans included a mixed ethnic bag of Illyrians, Thracians, Dacians, Goths, Sarmatians, Alans, and Scythians, while the mobile professional army primarily consisted of Goths and Huns. Despite the increased prosperity of the Balkan provinces after the 4th century, their intrinsic value to the empire never equaled that of the West Asian provinces, nor did they match Italy in terms of imperial prestige. If troops were needed to bolster the frontier defenses in the east against Persia, the peninsula's elite forces were dispatched. When Emperor Justinian the Great, 527–65, set out to reconquer North Africa and Italy from the Goths, his professional forces mostly were drawn from the Balkans. When the elite forces were absent, the peninsula lay vulnerable to attacks from the north. Justinian's gamble in the west was destined to have lasting significance for Balkan history. Risks were run in the Balkans because Justinian felt that he could depend on the frontier forces, using extensive fortifications and mountain defenses, to slow an enemy incursion until the elite units were freed from duties in the west and returned to deal with the situation. A large share of the ruinously high taxes imposed by Justinian was devoted to constructing new fortresses, renovating and enlarging older ones, and fortifying cities throughout the Balkans as compensation for the transfer of the mobile elite forces to combat fronts in the west. If the strategy of in-depth frontier defense proved insufficient and an enemy broke through before the elite forces returned, the emperor believed that he could depend on his capital to play the delaying role of last resort. Constantinople was the largest and strongest fortress city in Europe. It was situated on an easily defensible triangular bit of land on the European shore at the point where the Bosphorus Strait met the Sea of Marmara. Directly on its north was the large, crescent-shaped mouth of a small river emptying into the Bosphorus known as the Golden Horn. On the city's south stretched the Sea of Marmara, which found access to the Mediterranean through the Dardanelles Strait. The Bosphorus-Marmara-Dardanelles Seaway separated Europe from West Asia and linked the interior of Eurasia beyond the Black Sea directly to the Mediterranean. Geography lent Constantinople enormous advantages. The city was located at the most direct point along the continental divide for overland traffic to cross into the interiors of two continents, and it controlled the maritime traffic between Central Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean. Constantinople was the economic and military crossroads of Europe and Asia. By the Romans fortifying the triangle of land on which the city sat, Constantinople became impregnable. A seawall built at the water's edge girded its southern and northern sides. Protecting the wide western land side was the most extensive and strongest set of medieval walled defenses ever erected in Europe, incorporating a series of 3 successively higher and thicker stone ramparts protected by a moat. For 1,000 years the land walls of Constantinople saved the empire from defeat or even utter destruction by its enemies. When the Ottomans blasted holes in the land walls with artillery in 1453, the event signaled the end of Europe's Middle Ages. Constantinople's walls protected more than the empire's capital. They guarded the womb of an emerging Orthodox European civilization. The city gave concrete expression to Constantine's policy of reconstituting the Roman Empire on a Christian moral basis. Constantine was convinced that the empire's 3rd-century problems stemmed from a collapse of inner morale, which the traditional Hellenic religions did little to correct. Christianity was different. It provided adherents with a consistent meaning for human life and possessed a strong ethical moral system with the necessary sanctions for its enforcement. During his bloody rise to sole rule over an empire recently divided by Diocletian, Constantine recognized the utility of tying the outlawed Christian sect to the interests of his empire. Christianity could help strengthen and perpetuate the empire by morally unifying its people. For Christianity to serve Constantine's political purposes, it had to be correct orthodox in its beliefs, since a religion divided in its fundamental precepts offered little to a ruler who sought its use to reinvigorate a declining empire. Unfortunately, in Constantine's time Christianity was divided fanatically over its central issue of faith, the baffling and illogical nature of its Godhead, the Trinity, between two rival Christian camps, the Arians and Alexandrians. Within a year of becoming sole Roman emperor in 324, Constantine decided that a divided Christian church would not serve his purpose of buttressing his centralized imperial authority as the official state religion. Using the imperial position of Pontifex Maximus, in 325 Constantine determined to bring order to the Christian church by calling a general meeting of all leading church officials in the city of Nicaea. Constantine ordered them to settle the Arian/Alexandrian problem, set the agenda, presided over the sessions, and participated in the theological discussions. By the close of Christianity's First Ecumenical Council, an official creed was proclaimed and the high bishops, patriarchs, of Rome, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch were given canonical privileges that elevated them equally to the highest level of authority within the Church. The Christian Church emerged from Nicaea as the accepted state religion, with an administrative organization mirroring that of the empire. Nicaea had important consequences for the emperor and his authority within an increasingly Christian Roman Empire. Constantine's prominent role in the council demonstrated his intention to link the spiritual authority of Christianity closely to the civil authority of the state. Nicaea made Christianity an important component of the Roman Empire, and the active participation of the emperor in church matters made it hard to distinguish between politics and religion. The Christian leadership felt indebted to him for their church's meteoric rise from persecuted sect to favored faith. He was hailed as the 13th apostle of Christ and God's viceroy on earth. While initially these Christian accolades were bestowed on Constantine personally, they thereafter were transferred to the imperial office itself, as Constantine's successors continued to solidify bonds with the Church as a matter of state interest. The founding of Constantinople gave symbolic but concrete reality to a new imperial political ideology. The Christian state church represented the true believers' temporal community whose borders were synonymous with the Roman Empire. State and church were united in an indissoluble partnership that reflected a divinely ordained world order. The emperor's role in this partnership was obvious. To guarantee the divine temporal order, the Roman emperor acted as God's supreme civil representative, governing along Christian precepts and protecting the Christian empire against all enemies. He was assisted in this by an innate alliance with the Christian patriarchs, to whose number a fifth, that of Constantinople, was added in the early 5th century. While there existed only one Christian emperor of the Christian empire, no single patriarch was recognized as unqualified head of the Church. Spiritual authority was shared equally among them and was exerted collectively through ecumenical councils. Collective spiritual authority was extended somewhat to the emperor's office, in recognition of its divine preference, but decisions in matters of faith could be made only by the councils, with or without the emperor's participation. One fact was apparent, however: the Roman emperor emerged as the dominant authority figure in the Christian state. Thanks to Constantine, East Roman Christian Europe received a divinely sanctioned framework for strong, highly centralized, autocratic political authority. Constantine may have laid the groundwork for the emergence of a new Orthodox European civilization within a transformed East Roman, Byzantine, empire governed from Constantinople, but Emperor Justinian assured its success. Justinian was a ruler determined to solidify the autocratic power of his office and to realize the grandiose pretensions implied by the official Christian imperial ideology that equated the divine world order with the extent of the empire. Justinian spent his reign relentlessly pursuing imperialist goals in both domestic and foreign policy, to the point of driving the empire into near bankruptcy by the time of his death. Internally, Justinian concentrated on consolidating his supreme authority over the state by legal and religious means. He ordered the great collection and codification of Roman law that entrenched Christian precepts and eventually came to serve as the legal foundation for state government in much of both Eastern and Western Europe until the late 18th century. While the code and its summary were published in Latin, the supplemental books, consisting of Justinian's imperial decrees, appeared in Greek, officially demonstrating that Greek culture was supplanting the Latin in the Eastern Roman Empire. The Justinian Code not only furnished the state with a unitary body of justice, it also entrenched as law the will of the absolute monarch. To further his policy of cementing autocratic power through Christianity, Justinian sponsored expensive building campaigns. While much effort and resources were expended on practical civil projects, such as defensive fortifications, Justinian devoted particular attention to creating and propagating a new form of Christian church architecture intended to express the power and glory of the partnership between Christianity and the Roman imperial office. The result was epitomized in Justinian's magnificent imperial cathedral in Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, the holy wisdom. The domed structure epitomized the all-embracing, mystical Greek order of cultural reality and exuded symbolic representations of the emperor's supremely central role in the divinely ordained Christian universal order. The mystical persona of the Christian emperor was reinforced further by Justinian's copious borrowings of autocratic court rituals from neighboring Persia, the final incarnation of the ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The practice became commonplace in Constantinople and served to ritualize all aspects of the imperial office. By removing consideration of the person of the ruler and ritualizing his mystical inner spiritual character, Justinian fashioned the final step in shaping the ideological structure for Eastern Christian autocratic political power, giving the Hellenic tradition of deified Roman emperors its conclusive Christian facade. Girded with this mystical Christian aura, Justinian sought to assert his claim to supreme earthly authority in the religious sphere. He attempted to legislate theological matters in the same manner as he had the civil. Although his efforts ultimately failed, Justinian set a dangerous precedent that never disappeared completely from Orthodox European political ideology. Justinian's pretension to supreme spiritual authority has been branded Caesaropapism, control of the Church by the state. Western historians and theologians often have applied the term to Byzantine, Orthodox European, political realities, but, except for Justinian's failed effort and a few cases among later Byzantine and Balkan rulers, the term has been inappropriately used outside of Russia. The traditional church-state relationship characterizing Byzantine, Orthodox European, political realities was one of union, harmony, and synthesis of the two rather than the domination of one by the other. Using the re-establishment of Orthodox religious unity as a pretext, Justinian set out to recreate the undivided empire of the past by conquering former Western Roman lands from heretical Arian Germanic control. Between 535 and 554 he waged near-constant warfare in the West. At its successful conclusion, his empire encompassed the western lands of Italy, Sicily, most of North Africa, and the southern regions of Spain. His Vandal and Ostrogoth enemies were utterly eradicated. Administrative and religious unity of East and West was re-established, and, over it all, Justinian briefly reigned supreme from his capital at Constantinople. Justinian's reconquests in the West were the swan song for a unified Christian Hellenic world state. Costs for success were prohibitive, and the empire lay militarily and financially exhausted. In 568, 14 years after Justinian's victory, the Germanic Lombards successfully invaded Italy, and within 4 years the empire lost most of the peninsula, except for Rome, Ravenna, and the southern regions around Naples. Justinian died in 565 before the futility of his Western policies was revealed fully, but signs of insuperable strain in maintaining them arose even prior to his death. Already, in the last decade of his life, Avar and Slav forces penetrated the empire's Balkan possessions in a prelude to the inundations that followed during the next century and a half.